Until recently, international trade was shaped mainly by price, quality, and origin. CBAM introduces another variable: the carbon emitted during production. Using the image of a canal lock, this video explains how the European Union is adjusting the carbon price treatment of certain imports and why carbon data is becoming part of market access. What exactly is CBAM? It is often described as a carbon tax or a new tariff at Europe's borders, but neither description fully captures how it works. A more useful image is that of a canal lock. On one side, goods may have been produced under a different carbon pricing system or without an explicit carbon price. On the other side lies the European market, where producers operate under the European Union emissions trading system. CBAM is the mechanism that manages the difference between those two carbon price environments. It does not prohibit the passage of goods, and it does not reduce the emissions already embedded in them. It measures those emissions and adjusts the carbon price treatment associated with them. But why did Europe consider such a mechanism necessary? The answer begins with a problem known as carbon leakage. European industries face an increasingly significant carbon constraint. But if this raises their production costs, some industrial activity may move outside the European Union to countries where carbon emissions face a lower price or no price at all. European production may also be replaced by imports manufactured under more carbon-intensive conditions. In either case, Europe may appear to reduce its domestic emissions, while global emissions remain unchanged or even increase. This is what carbon leakage means. Carbon does not physically leak across the border. Production and the emissions associated with it are displaced. The emissions have not disappeared, they have merely changed location. To understand the European response, we now need to look at the higher side of the lock. Inside the European Union, many carbon-intensive producers operate under the EU Emissions Trading System, or EU ETS. The system places a limit on emissions and requires covered producers to account for them through emissions allowances. Carbon therefore becomes a cost of production. Without an adjustment, an imported product made under a much lower carbon constraint could compete in the same European market with a producer already facing the EU ETS. CBAM extends part of that carbon pricing logic to certain imported goods. Its certificate price is linked to the price of EU ETS allowances. This does not mean that the foreign producer enters the EU ETS. It means that the embedded emissions of the imported goods become subject to an EU ETS-linked adjustment. Same European market, but a more comparable carbon constraint. So how is this adjustment actually determined? The process begins with the production facility outside the European Union. The embedded emissions of the covered goods must be calculated. That information is transmitted through the supply chain to the authorized CBAM declarant, usually the importer or, in some cases, an indirect customs representative. The importer carries the formal European obligation, but the producer supplies the essential evidence. If a qualifying carbon price has already been effectively paid in the country of production, that amount may be taken into account. The remaining obligation is translated into CBAM certificates linked to the EU ETS price. But this is not at all paid instantly when the goods cross the border. Imports made during the year are reconciled through an annual CBAM declaration, followed by the surrender of the required certificates. From 2027, declarants must also maintain a minimum certificate position during the year, corresponding to part of their accumulated emissions exposure. So the goods may pass through the lock before the final annual settlement, but their passage creates a measurable data and financial obligation. The importer must anticipate that future cost in its financial planning and purchasing decisions. That pressure can then travel backward through the value chain to the exporter and ultimately to the production facility. But CBAM does not apply to every product entering Europe. CBAM currently concentrates on goods associated with 6 carbon-intensive categories: iron and steel, aluminium, cement, fertilizers, electricity, and hydrogen. But this list must be interpreted carefully. CBAM does not automatically cover every company operating within one of these broad sectors. Legal coverage depends on the precise customs classification of the imported product. Some precursors and selected downstream goods are also included. The right question is therefore not simply, is this company in the aluminium or steel sector? The more precise questions are, is the particular product covered? Is it being imported into the European Union? And how much carbon is embedded in its production? Once those 3 questions are answered, the strategic consequences extend far beyond the border itself. So the vessel itself can now continue into the European market. Its cargo has not changed, its embedded emissions have not disappeared, and the vessel itself has not entered the EU emissions trading system. What has changed is the regulatory and financial environment surrounding those goods. Their embedded emissions must be measured, the supporting evidence must be credible, and the importer must meet the resulting CBAM obligation through the certificate system. Carbon data, therefore, becomes part of market access infrastructure. For exporters, the consequences are commercial. Importers may demand better emission data, negotiate prices differently, select lower carbon production facilities, or impose new contractual requirements on their suppliers. This is how a European obligation can influence decisions far beyond Europe. CBAM does not end international trade. It changes the conditions under which certain products compete. Carbon is no longer only an environmental externality. It is becoming a measurable variable in international trade.